The Narcissist Who is King, Part 3. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Continued examination of the behaviours of Sheriff Scott to help you understand how a narcissist wields power in a particularly isolated environment, giving him the powers as if he was a king. For years after her release from jail, Ms. Jones said she tried to put these abuses behind her. She stopped getting messages from the sheriff after blocking his number near the beginning of 2020, she said, imposition of no-contact regime. Then, in September 2021, a woman who had worked for the Clay County Sheriff's Office came forward with new accusations that threatened to bring attention to years of alleged sexual misconduct by Sheriff Scott. Caitlin Wilson, a former investigative assistant who alleged sexual harassment, filed an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaint that said Sheriff Scott had made sexual advances toward her and threatened to fire her after she rebuked him. Sense of entitlement, manipulative behaviour, lack of emotional empathy, use of threat, nullification of threat to control. She made reference to other women whose similar experiences had not yet been made public. My situation has been exacerbated, her complaint said, citing multiple women either in jail or employed by the county who had made claims that the sheriff was having sex with them. It appears to be well known within the county that the sheriff suffers from a sexual addiction. Note, sexual addiction is often stated as something of itself when invariably it's just a manifestation of the behaviour of a narcissist who uses sex to control and draw fuel. And this sexual addiction has affected my work performance and is causing me extreme fear and anxiety. The EEOC did not weigh in on the merits of Ms. Wilson's complaint, but determined she had the right to sue. In the lawsuit she filed in May 2022, Ms. Wilson described a group chat in which Sheriff Scott had sent several employees a steady stream of sexually explicit text messages. Hoovering, lack of boundary recognition, sense of entitlement. His messages, reviewed by reporters, referred to women as hookers, heifers, and hoes. In one text, the sheriff suggested Ms. Wilson and Ms. Stanger should tag team to give him oral sex. In others, he called himself a stallion and said women liked to be hammered. Pictures the sheriff sent, which he called humorous memes on the Humour Channel, under oath as part of the lawsuit, compared women to dogs that needed to be trained and joked about date rape, belittlement. Ms. Wilson said she decided to file her complaint after Sheriff Scott rubbed his crotch against her as he walked past her one day in the office. Lack of boundary recognition. I felt very violated, she said in an interview. I was just so shocked and surprised because he was my boss. Sheriff Scott denial, touching Miss Wilson inappropriately, saying he was rubbing a high fever that day. I was sick as a dog, he said. Grabbing a woman was the last thing on my mind. He told reporters that none of his texts, including sexual content, and said under oath that anyone in the group chat could have stopped participating at any time. When Ms. Wilson filed her complaint, Sheriff Scott assigned one of his own deputies to investigate. The final report concluded that the allegations were unsubstantiated and punitive, and dismissed Sheriff Scott's texts as adult humour shared among willing participants. As the deputy investigated, Miss Wilson said she found herself increasingly isolated at work, silent treatment. She was barred from carrying her gun at the office and told to eat lunch at her desk. Most of her co-workers stopped talking to her, she said. In December 2021, 3 months after Miss Wilson filed her initial complaint, Sheriff Scott suspended her then boyfriend, Jeremy Bell, a captain who had worked in the office for 5 years. According to a personnel report signed by Sheriff Scott, Mr. Bell had violated department policy by driving his patrol car outside of Clay County to visit Ms. Wilson's house in a neighbouring town. He was fired 2 days after Christmas. Nullification of threat to control. It was around this time that Ms. Jones, who had not heard from Sheriff Scott for months, found herself under the scrutiny of local law enforcement again, she said. Several weeks after Ms. Wilson submitted her complaint citing allegations that women in the jail had been forced to have sex with Sheriff Scott, Ms. Jones was pulled over by a narcotics officer from West Point, a town of about 10,000 people in Clay County. The officer discovered a bag of diabetic needles filled with meth under her passenger seat and arrested her, Ms. Jones believes the drugs were planted there. I knew I was being set up, she said. Frustrated and facing time behind bars, Ms. Jones decided 2 months later to post on a Facebook page called Mississippi Corruption, where she detailed for the first time her allegations against the sheriff. I was fixing to go to prison for a really long time for something that I didn't even do, just because he was mad over his mistakes, over things that he had done, she said. A few months later, in April 2022, Miss Jones received a video from her friend Madison Ray, she said. Ms. Ray said she had secretly recorded a conversation with Joshua Fulham, a local diabetic man with prior drug arrests, because she suspected someone had planted the drugs while they were all hanging out the night before Miss Jones' arrest. The recording on Miss Ray's cell phone captures him explaining how and why he placed the drugs in Miss Jones's car. I put dope under that seat like Kyle told me to, he says. I didn't have to use mine. Kyle gave it to me. According to Ms. Wilson's lawsuit, Mr. Fulham is referring to Deputy Kyle Eves, who used to work for Sheriff Scott. The apparent purpose of Deputy Sheriff Eves causing drugs to be planted upon Jones is to intimidate Jones or to cause her to be arrested so that she will lack credibility in claiming an involuntary sexual relationship with defendant Scott, the complaint states. Use of a lieutenant for the purposes of assertion of control. Let's hear that recording.
So, how did you set Amber up? How did you set Amber up?
Man, I put the dope up under the seat like Kyle told me to.
What? Get the fuck out.
Not gonna be here.
Oh my God.
A short recording corroborating what Jones is alleging. After the video spread around town, Mr. Fulham was arrested on drug possession charges, taken to the jail and made a trustee, nullification of threat to control. About 6 months later, he made a video at the Clay County Jail and had it posted on Facebook. He accused Ms. Jones of being a liar out to get Sheriff Scott, but never recanted his previous statements. She needs help and rehab just like me, Mr. Fulham said in the video, and she needs to leave the sheriff alone. The sheriff sent a copy of the video to reporters and pointed to it as proof that Ms. Jones and others were lying, nullification of threat to control. Seems like their plan is coming to light, he said. Neither Mr. Fulham nor Mr. Eves responded to requests for comment. About 6 months after the video was made, another potential witness in Ms. Jones's case changed his story too. Her former boyfriend, Edward Adam Todd, had been arrested by Clay County deputies and was facing up to 50 years in prison for 2 burglary charges. After initially backing up Ms. Jones's allegations, Mr. Todd later told investigators that he had lied to get the sheriff in trouble, according to transcripts of his April sentencing hearing. The court transcripts show that Judge Kitchens praised Mr. Todd for his change of heart, saying his statements cleared a local member of law enforcement that had been accused of something that probably turns out was not true. At the hearing, the prosecutor suggested a 7-year prison sentence for Mr. Todd, citing his help to law enforcement. Judge Kitchens further reduced his sentence, cutting it to 4 years. Instead of being transferred to prison to serve his sentence, Mr. Todd has remained at the Clay County Jail, where he could not immediately be reached for comment. Sheriff Scott believes that he will be vindicated and that voters will see through the allegations to re-elect him in the deciding Democratic primary election on August the 8th. He has won his previous elections easily, but this time he faces an unexpected opponent who is an experienced law enforcement officer in Clay County, his own Chief Deputy, Ramirez Williams. In February, Chief Deputy Williams announced his run for sheriff. The next month, Sheriff demoted him to work the graveyard shift as a jailer, nullification of threat to control. When asked if Mr. Williams' candidacy played a role in his demotion, the sheriff replied, not necessarily, and declined to comment further. Sheriff Scott insists he will leave office on his own terms, regardless of what becomes of the accusations against him. He said he believes the federal investigation is over and he cooperated with their review, even voluntarily meeting with federal authorities to answer questions. I wasn't going to let a bunch of drug heads run me out of office, he said. The sheriff said he had been burned by extending compassion to people behind bars, but had no plans to stop. You can't turn your back, he said. One of these days, I might be in the same shape. He chuckled. You never know. An interesting examination of the power that's wielded by a narcissist in an environment where there are very few, if any, checks and balances upon him. You can see the repeated instances of his abuse of power, demonstrating a sense of entitlement and a lack of accountability to his post. Also, the repeated instances of where the alleged threats to control occurred, resulting in the nullification threat to control through the responses that he gave, also utilising members of the coterie and lieutenants. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.